Welcome to Lair the Alchemist, where we discuss all things heavy metal and hard rock. On today's episode, heavy hidden gems from the 70s. This is where me and my special guest here are going to be sharing with you some kind of more rare, off the beaten path, obscure, heavy 70s proto-metal type albums that we think you should check out. And I want to turn this into a regular series here, where I'm going to try to do this at least a couple times a month. And my special guest here for this and the next couple episodes he goes by the name Greeno. So Greeno, thank you for joining me here at the Lair.
Right on. Thanks for having me, man. Always a good time.
Yeah, and Greeno, he's been on the show before. We did a Heavy Hidden Gems of the 80s, or American Steel. Now that was an American Steel episode where we had some picks that were kind of obscure 80s bands. And Greeno is often on a show called The Man Cave of Doom on YouTube. I've been on that show a few times also. And on The Man Cave, me and Greeno started talking, and we realized that we both had a real passion and love for kind of exploring and finding and discovering obscure, heavy 70s records. And I thought, all right, when I thought of making this a regular series, he was the first guy that I thought of to do this. So I'm glad he was able to, I'm glad you're able to be here, because I know this is going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah, this is great, man. I mean, it was cool to talk to you about heavy 70s and how, you kind of fell down this rabbit hole too, man. It's like, we're about the same age, teenagers in the 80s, and we dug back in, finding all the obscure 80s stuff. And then somehow you fall into that heavy 70s rabbit hole too, man. And it's like, wow, there's all this crazy 70s stuff I never heard either. And then you start digging for it,
Yeah, it was when it started for me when I started collecting vinyl, because at that time I was still able to get some of this stuff for cheap. And what I mean is, this was the more popular, quote, obscure bands, and with the recent passing of Burke Shelley from Budgie, I did a tribute, and I mentioned on that video that Budgie was kind of like a gateway band to the more obscure 70s stuff. I wouldn't call them totally obscure. Metallica covered some of their stuff, and I was into doom metal in like the mid to late 90s, and a lot of the doom bands would mention some of these heavy 70s type of bands, and Budgie always came up. So Budgie was a band that I first got into, and then Budgie led to Sir Lord Baltimore and Captain Beyond, and those are kind of like, when people first talk about heavy 70s, usually those are some of the names that come up first, Budgie, Sir Lord Baltimore, Captain Beyond. And I've done videos on Captain Beyond and Sir Lord Baltimore. You can check those out on the channel. But like you said, it's fun. Then you sort of go down this sort of rabbit hole. And I think in the last, I don't know, I'm going to say in the last 15, 12 years or so, it seems like there's a lot of labels now that are sort of specializing in this, finding these obscure bands and re-releasing their stuff. So in the last 10, 12 or so years, it's been easier to find these bands, to find reissues of their stuff and discover more bands.
Yeah, it's just kind of like they're doing with the 80s, obscure metal stuff. There's all these crazy reissues, same thing with the 70s. And like when you were talking about Sir Lord Baltimore, and I always think of them, you had the A-level bands with Sabbath and Deep Purple and all that. And then those B-level bands is where you kind of, everybody kind of hears about them, but not everybody knows, Budgie and everything.
Yeah.
But then it starts getting crazy when you get to that C level, and then really crazy when you get to the D level,
Yeah.
And that's the fun stuff, It's like some of it's really cool, and some it's like, it's heavy 70s reminds me of new wave of British heavy metal, because new wave of British heavy metal, but let's also pull all these other bands into new wave, you know what I mean? Because they were active at the time. Sometimes you pick up some of those albums that people consider new wave of British heavy metal. It's like, okay.
Yeah.
Just kind of hard rock. And same thing can kind of be said with the heavy 70s stuff, because especially the earlier stuff, a lot of it is very psych influenced and all that. The further you get into the 70s, it gets kind of more heavy blues and, then hard rock. So it's a fun thing to explore. I kind of started with it. The first one that really, really got me into it, I mean, I'd heard Budgie and that kind of thing, but Lucifer's Friend, the first
Yeah,
album.
yeah, that's
I
another.
pi- yeah, I picked that up and that just blew me away. And then I'd also come across some of I don't know if you've are familiar with Monster Records. They kind of turned into
Mhm.
Rockadrome,
Yeah.
but they were releasing all this cool stuff like Amulet and
Mhm.
Truth or Janie and all
Yeah.
that stuff. It was just, that's what kind of sucked me down the rabbit hole. And I went for probably, I don't know, 6, 7 years just finding everything I could. Just
Yeah.
great reissues. And like you said, there was at that time you could still pick up some stuff, original pressings, they weren't all in collections yet. They were still floating around.
Yeah, and like you said, when it comes to this kind of stuff, it can be tricky. Like the stuff from like the late 60s tends to have that psych garage element to it.
Mhm.
The early 70s, what you find with these, you mentioned like C level and D level bands, when you're digging really, really deep,
Mhm.
you'll find these bands where all they released was maybe something that they pressed themselves. They pressed
Yeah.
a couple hundred copies themselves, or it's just a demo. So sometimes the quality can be range from really bad to surprise shockingly good. Some of
Mhm.
these bands, the one of the bands on my list for this episode, they were on a major label at one point. So, but they never broke out. Nobody ever heard of them. One album, and then they're gone. So there's a lot of that kind of stuff. But what I like about it is it sort of feels like it's like an archaeological dig. you know,
Absolutely, man.
you're finding these bands, and even though the recording quality might be not the greatest, and it's a little lo-fi and maybe a little sloppy in the playing, but it feels like you've just sort of discovered like a primitive tool or something. It's like
Yeah.
that's not the point. You don't find like a tool from 2000 years ago and go, well, heck, I could buy a better hammer than this at Walmart. That's not the point. The point is that you just found this thing that somebody was used. So for me, that's what I find so exciting about this stuff, especially because in the 70s there was nothing really before this for people to draw from. Bands in the 80s, they're drawing their heaviness from, they had the 70s and the late 60s to choose from. If you're a band in 70, 71, I mean, I guess if you go back to Cream and
Blue Cheer.
yeah, Blue Cheer, Jimi Hendrix, they were probably influenced by that. But it doesn't go much for heavy stuff much farther back than that. So a lot of these bands were uh, just sort of experimenting and finding their way and
Mhm.
trying to do different things. So there's this sort of innocence to some of this stuff that I think is an experimental, innocent nature to a lot of this stuff that I find really, really cool.
Yeah, and you have to be a little open-minded too, because you got to remember the era. And
Yeah.
if you're a metal guy and you hear people talk about heavy 70s, yeah, there's heavy 70s, but not all of them sound like Deep Purple and Black Sabbath and Priest and all that in the 70s. Some of these bands are just very blues based but heavy and killer guitar players, and some with the psych and all that. You have to be a little open minded, but the more you dig into it, the more it kind of opens up to you. And it's just like it's a cool era to dig into. I loved it when I mean I was really, really crazy over this stuff for about 6, 7 years. I was just picking up everything I could find. And like you said, with the reissues, and a little tip, the reissues are great, but take the hype stickers with a grain of salt,
Oh,
because
yeah.
whenever you pick up some old band you never heard of from 73 and the hype sticker mentions Thin Lizzy and Black
Yeah, yeah,
Sabbath, and
yeah.
it's like, okay, let's see
We're
what
going to talk
happens.
about that with my pick for this episode. That was going to be something I was going to mention, that you have to keep an open mind. Also, a lot of these records, they can be slightly inconsistent. There'll be some
Mhm.
songs on it that are like, wow, this is really heavy for its time. And then all of a sudden there's a song that,
With a flute in it or
yeah, or
something.
it's
Yeah,
like
it's like
a folk rock, Bob Dylan folk rock, or,
right.
it's real kind of scattershot because the
Yeah.
bands weren't as focused, or maybe they didn't quite 100% have their sound honed in. A lot of these bands didn't have a list producers and stuff like that. So
Right.
So yeah, you have to kind of you kind of go into it with uh, you get your expectations. You got to understand the era that this stuff happened in, and so you're going to get a mixed bag sometimes of some really great stuff, and then there might be a clunker or two on the album, or something that just doesn't stylistically fit with the others. And like you said, the definition of heaviness here, when we're saying heavy, we're not talking, if you talk about heavy in the 90s, that's a different definition of heavy than heavy in the 70s. Martin Popoff has his Collector's Guide to Heavy Metal, and he breaks them into eras. He's got a 70s book, an 80s book, a 90s book. And in the 70s book, he gives it his own personal rating and heaviness rating. But he says, the criteria, the scale that we're using to judge heaviness in the 70s is different than the criteria that we would use to judge heaviness in the 80s or the 90s,
right?
Or, whatever.
Yeah. It's like you talk to younger people now, and it's like, heavy metal from the 80s didn't really exist. That was just hard rock. That was
Yeah.
and
Right.
us in the 80s, stuff in the 70s was more hard rock to me than metal. But guys in the 70s, that was metal hard rock to them.
Yeah.
It's all where you're coming from.
For sure. All right. Well, what do you got for your pick for today?
I got one of my favorite, and this was an early on. Definitely came across this album, early on in his journey through the heavy 70s, and it's A Third of a Lifetime by Three Man Army. Just killer power trio, and this was 71 on a Karma, and this is an original press. I don't know if this has been reissued or not, but like I said, power trio, and this was the Gervitz brothers, Adrian and Paul Gervitz.
Okay.
Now they'd kind of been around. Killer guitar player. I think Adrian was a guitar player, if I remember right. And they'd been around. They'd been in a band called, I just kind of pulled these to show real quick. And this is kind of interesting because we talked about that early 70s stuff had a lot of that psych influence on it. And these two dudes were in a band called Gun, and they put out two albums. These are two reissues, and very psych influence. There's cool guitar work on here, kind of fuzzed out here and there, and interesting, definitely worth checking out. But by the time they get to Three Man Army, much more what you're kind of looking for, what I'm looking for. Yeah. The psych stuff can be interesting in the heavy 70s stuff, but I kind of like when the psych is kind of moved out and we're into that heavy guitar work and crazy leads, cool vocals. These guys put out they put out 3 albums. They recorded a 4th album, but it didn't get released until like 2005 or something. But after that, you may have come across some of these, the Baker Gervitz Army, which is, the two brothers with Ginger Baker. And I think they did 3 albums together also. Same kind of deal, that heavy 70s, But that Three Man Army, it's like I said, it was one of the early ones I came across. And not Ginger Baker, Buddy Miles is on one track on there playing drums. I think the very first track on the album, which is one of the better tracks actually. But all 3 of their albums are very cool. But that first one just caught me. It might be because it was the first one, I heard by the band. And I found heavy 70s. If you can say heavy 70s power trio, you're onto something. Yeah. It seems like when it's a power trio, man, it checks all the boxes. There's no screwing around. Yeah. You're most likely going to get some heavy bass blues and killer guitar player. So that's kind of the lane I stay in. I've tried out everything, and I have a bunch of the stuff with the psych stuff and all that. But once you get into that pure guitar driven blues based, that's where I live.
Yeah, same for me. And I always like the trio format because it gives usually the bass player, I'm a bass player, so I like when the bass player has a lot of room to move around, a la Jack Bruce and Cream, or Grand Funk Railroad, that kind of thing.
Hell yeah, man.
All right. Well, my pick here is a band called Strife, and the album is called Rush. Now, Greeno, you were talking about be cautious of hype stickers. I want to read the hype sticker for
These are
everybody out
always
there.
great.
Yeah. Strife, Rush, that's the name of the album. Iron Maiden's main influence that helped create their classic sound. For fans of Iron Maiden, 70s era Judas Priest, 70s era Scorpions, 70s era Rush, and 70s era Black Sabbath. All right. Now, there's maybe a slight kernel of truth to some of these things. For one, I've never heard, let's talk about Strife first. Three-piece, and they're British. This album came out in 75. They had one album after this. They were actually on a major label. They were on Chrysalis, which is like the label that UFO was on, and I believe Jethro Tull was on Chrysalis. So they were on a major label, and they had, seemed like they had the world in front of them, but it just it didn't happen for them. The bass player and lead vocalist, whose name is Gordon Rowley, he would go on to play in this band Nightwing, which is this is on Gull Records. Gull Records is Gordon Rowley. He would go on in this band. This is kind of like a new wave of British heavy metal, but maybe a little more melodic, popish, if you will.
They're kind of one of those bands that come on in, guys. You could be part of this if I remember.
Right. All right, so on to the record now. All right, and back to that hype sticker. So I would describe the band as slightly progressive. There's definitely heavy moments on it. The two weakest songs are the first song on each side. So the first song on side A is Back Streets of Heaven, and side B is Life is Easy. And those both sound like almost like glam rockish, like, rock, kind of stock, upbeat, maybe like a heavy, sweet type of thing. Mm-hmm. Now, the rest of the album is more kind of progressive, maybe a little bit of budgie, a little bit of jamming, that kind of vibe to it. The Iron Maiden reference. Now, I've never heard Steve Harris mention this band. If somebody out there can comment down below if Steve Harris has ever talked about this band.
I was going to say that too. I've never heard that.
I've never heard him mention this band. All right. But there's a song called Man of the Wilderness, where there's a riff at the beginning that sounds a lot like Killers. Just like 15 seconds, it sounds like it. Okay. And there's a riff in the final song on the record, the title track, Rush, that has a riff that sounds very Iron Maiden-like. Mm-hmm. But outside of that, I hear no relation to Iron Maiden. There's no Black Sabbath. There's none of that kind of like doom. There's no doom element to this. I mean, maybe Judas Priest in the more first album, Judas Priest, Rock-a-Rolla, mm-hmm. Maybe. But outside of all that, there is still some really cool stuff on it. Like the title track is awesome. It's like there's only 3 songs on side 2, and the title track is, I don't know, 10 minutes long or something. And they jam out really hard on that. There's a couple other songs. I keep putting it back here because I got to keep it up here. Man of the Wilderness is the one with the Iron Maiden riff. That's really cool. Magic of the Dawn, Indian Dream has like a keyboard line in it. It's kind of like a Middle Eastern sounding almost thing, which is pretty cool. And there's some heavy guitar. The vocals are clean, not too high pitched. He's got sort of a clean higher register, but it's not like a Robert Plant or Geddy Lee or anything like that. When they do stretch out more into the proggy type stuff, it's more in a jammy kind of way, rather than like a Rush kind of tight prog type thing. This is more like open-ended kind of jamming. Which is cool. There's a lot of great bass playing on it. It was very hard to find any information on the band. The record comes with this lyric sleeve and a little bit of a history
Oh, that's cool.
thing on the inside, but there's very little information on them on the internet.
Yeah,
So
that's something else interesting we should mention, along with the psych kind of creeps into this stuff. Prog creeps into it too sometimes, where you can get like a pretty cool heavy band that'll have 10-minute songs and no vocals or whatever. It's just like you get a little bit of everything once you start jumping into this. And that took me a while to get my head around, as far as, okay, all this stuff is considered heavy 70s, but it's very different. You know what I mean? There's a lot of different styles within that. So
yeah, and you always have to, as demonstrated by this hype sticker, I would feel bad if this is an example of the first songs on each side of the record. I would feel bad if somebody reads this hype sticker or reads something somewhere, and then they go in to hear that first song and they're thinking this sounds like boogie rock,
right,
glam blues boogie rock or something, and it just doesn't fit the the rest of the record. So this is an example of, you have to be careful what what you listen to with some of these bands. If you don't like one song, listen to something else, because sometimes these bands can really shift gears. The last song on the record doesn't really sound anything like those first two songs. You wouldn't even think they were the same band.
right.
And you're right. The definition of prog, a lot of this stuff is more, it's prog in the sense that they're kind of long songs and they're jamming out. Of course, there's many different, you could prog, you could be talking about ELP with classical like pieces, or yes, but this is more in a jammy sense of the word, with kind of longer songs. But there's still some pretty heavy riffs on it. The guitar is distorted and has a nice sound to it. The recording quality is good. It's not super slick or anything, but it's definitely not like lo-fi. It's kind of, right there in the middle. You can hear all the instruments. So it's, it's a fun record. And, you can hear some of the, I could hear maybe Steve Harris heard this record, and because there are those two riffs on the record that are very, very Iron Maiden like. And I mean, that's it. Just those two riffs, no melody lines, nothing else. So maybe, but so it's really, so for fans of, if you like, maybe like the first Judas Priest album, maybe like the first Rush album. Okay, if you wanted to make a Rush comparison, because it's sort of that bluesy type of thing. So
yeah, that band's definitely on the radar, and the same guy turned both of us onto it, I think.
Yeah.
But the two albums, I kind of checked them out, and they're, like I said, they're definitely on the radar. I just haven't pulled the trigger yet, but it's interesting what I've heard so far. Definitely.
Yeah. All right, well, there you go. There's our first episode of Heavy Hidden Gems from the 70s. What I'm going to do is I'm going to leave a link in the description down below, so you guys can check out the two bands that we mentioned today. If you haven't heard them, check them out. Come back, let us know what you think. If you've already heard these bands, let us know what you guys think in the description down below, and stay tuned for our next episode, where we will be sharing even more obscure, rare gems that we've dug up from the deep earth here, just for you guys to check out. Okay, until we see you again, I'd like to thank Greeno for joining me here at the Lair.
Thanks for having me, man.
And until we see you again, make sure you rock hard, ride free.